The year was 1943, and the Pacific War had reached a fevered pitch. On remote islands scattered across the vast ocean, American forces clashed with Japanese soldiers in some of the most brutal combat the world had ever witnessed. The fighting was characterized by its intensity, the unforgiving jungle terrain, and perhaps most notably, by a clash of military cultures so profound that it would shape the treatment of prisoners on both sides. For Japanese soldiers, surrender was unthinkable. The Bushido Code, deeply embedded in their military training, taught that capture represented the ultimate disgrace, a shame worse than death itself. The Imperial Japanese Army's Senjinkan Military Code, issued in 1941, explicitly forbade surrender under any circumstances. Soldiers were told that to be captured was to bring eternal dishonor upon oneself, one's family, and one's ancestors. Death in battle was glorious. Captivity was abhorrent. This cultural conditioning had profound implications. Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity born partly from the belief that they would never be taken alive. When circumstances made surrender inevitable, when wounded, unconscious, or simply overwhelmed by superior forces, those who became prisoners of war entered captivity expecting the worst. They had been told that American forces were barbaric, that torture and execution awaited them. Many genuinely believed they would be killed. What happened instead would challenge everything these soldiers had been taught to believe. The early months of the Pacific Campaign yielded few Japanese prisoners. At Guadalcanal, during the 6 months of fighting that raged from August 1942 to February 1943, American forces took fewer than 1,000 prisoners out of the approximately 31,000 Japanese troops engaged in the battle. The rest fought to the death or died from disease and starvation in the jungle. Those who were captured often came into American hands unconscious from wounds, dehydration, or exhaustion. Sergeant Takeo Yamamoto, who was captured on Guadalcanal in November 1942 after collapsing from dysentery and malaria, later recalled his first moments of consciousness in American custody. "I opened my eyes expecting to see the face of my executioner," he remembered in a post-war interview. "Instead, I saw a young American corpsman cleaning my wounds. He was speaking softly, though I could not understand his words. When I tried to pull away, he gently restrained me and continued his work. I was confused. This was not what I had been told would happen." The American military had quickly recognized that proper treatment of Japanese POWs served multiple strategic purposes. Intelligence gathered from prisoners proved invaluable. Additionally, well-treated prisoners who could testify to humane conditions might encourage others to surrender, potentially saving American lives. But beyond strategy, there was also a genuine sense among many American servicemen that basic human decency demanded proper treatment of captured enemy soldiers. This wasn't always easy. The Pacific War was extraordinarily bitter. American troops had witnessed, and would continue to witness, atrocities committed by Japanese forces. The Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino POWs died from brutality and neglect, had occurred in April 1942. Stories of Japanese soldiers refusing to take prisoners, of booby-trapped wounded, of civilians forced to commit suicide, circulated among American forces. Yet military leadership, from General Douglas MacArthur down through the ranks, insisted on adherence to the Geneva Convention regarding treatment of prisoners. This policy was maintained not just for moral reasons, but because American leaders knew that reciprocal treatment of their own POWs in Japanese hands might depend partly on how America treated its captives. By late 1943, Several POW camps had been established to house Japanese prisoners. These facilities were set up in relatively secure rear areas, some in Hawaii, others in Australia, and a few on larger, firmly controlled Pacific islands. Camp Tracy, near Byron Hot Springs in California, and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin also held Japanese POWs transferred to the continental United States for intelligence purposes. The camps were basic but adequate. Prisoners lived in barracks with bunks, had access to washing facilities, received regular meals, and had access to medical care. By the standards of wartime prisoner facilities, and particularly compared to the horrific conditions in Japanese-run POW camps, they were remarkably humane. But to the Japanese prisoners, conditioned to expect torture and death, the mere fact of these basic amenities was shocking. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, captured on New Georgia in July 1943, later described his first week in captivity. "Each day I waited to be executed. I could not understand why the Americans fed us. Why give food to men you plan to kill? The other prisoners and I discussed this constantly. Some thought the Americans were fattening us before they killed us. Others believed they were extracting intelligence through kindness, and that once we were no longer useful, we would be shot. None of us considered that they might simply be following their own codes of military conduct. The psychological state of these prisoners cannot be overstated. They existed in a liminal space between their old identity as Imperial Japanese soldiers and an uncertain future. Most believed their families had been told they were dead. Returning to Japan seemed impossible, not just because of the war, but because the shame of capture felt insurmountable. Many prisoners contemplated suicide, but found themselves unable to complete the act, which only deepened their sense of failure and dishonor. Into this environment of confusion, shame, and fear came the small, daily acts of American military personnel that slowly began to shift perceptions. A guard who learned to say a few words in Japanese. A cook who noticed a prisoner was particularly thin and gave him extra rations. A doctor who worked late into the night to save a prisoner suffering from complications of old wounds. These actions were often simple, even mundane. But to men who expected brutality, they were revelatory. As November 1943 approached, camp commanders at several POW facilities faced a unique question: what to do about Thanksgiving? The holiday was deeply embedded in American military culture. Wherever American forces served, tremendous effort went into providing Thanksgiving meals. Supply ships carried frozen turkeys across thousands of miles of ocean. Field kitchens prepared elaborate spreads, even in forward areas. The holiday represented home, family, gratitude, and community, core American values that took on heightened significance for men far from their families and facing an uncertain future. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington commanded a facility that held approximately 180 Japanese POWs, most captured in the Solomon Islands campaign. Harrington was a career officer, a veteran of World War I, and a man who took seriously his responsibilities under the Geneva Convention. He had observed the psychological state of his charges and understood that they lived in a kind of emotional purgatory. In early November, Harrington made a decision. The Japanese prisoners would receive the same Thanksgiving meal as the American troops. This was not a foregone conclusion. Military regulations required adequate food for prisoners, but there was no obligation to include them in holiday celebrations. Some officers at other camps would choose to give prisoners a slightly enhanced meal, but nothing approaching the full Thanksgiving spread. Harrington's decision went further. He called together his staff to explain his reasoning. According to Lieutenant Robert Chen, a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, interpreter, who was present. The colonel said he'd been thinking about those men in the prisoner compound. He said they were soldiers who'd fought for their country, just like we had. They'd lost, and they were prisoners, but they were still human beings. He said that Thanksgiving was about gratitude and recognizing our common humanity. He wanted to extend that to the prisoners. Some of the men grumbled. There was still a lot of anger about Pearl Harbor, about the things we'd heard happen to our guys in Japanese camps. But the colonel was firm. The preparation for the Thanksgiving meal was extensive. Cooks began work days in advance. Turkeys had to be defrosted, vegetables prepared, pies baked. The logistics of feeding hundreds of men, both guards and prisoners, a feast in the middle of a Wisconsin winter, required careful planning. But perhaps more challenging was the question of how to explain this gesture to the prisoners themselves. Lieutenant Chen and the other interpreters were tasked with informing the POWs that they would be receiving a special meal on the upcoming Thursday and attempting to explain what Thanksgiving meant. "It was harder than you might think," Chen recalled. "There's no real Japanese equivalent to Thanksgiving. We tried to explain it was a harvest festival, a time to be grateful, but the prisoners couldn't understand why this would extend to them." One man asked me directly, "Why would the Americans share their celebration with us? We are enemies. We are defeated. We have brought shame." I didn't have a good answer. Thanksgiving Day, 1943 at Camp McCoy dawned cold and clear. Snow had fallen the night before, covering the camp in a blanket of white. For the American guards and personnel, many of whom were from warmer climates, the Wisconsin winter was a challenge. For the Japanese prisoners, many from tropical or temperate regions of the Pacific, it was nearly unbearable. Extra blankets had been distributed, and the barracks were kept heated, but the bitter cold was a constant presence. At 1100 hours, the prisoners were assembled in the mess hall. This was itself unusual. Normally, food was distributed to be eaten in the barracks. But for this meal, the decision had been made to have everyone eat together in the large dining facility. The prisoners entered uncertainly. Many expected some kind of trick or trap. The past months had slowly eroded their certainty that they would be executed, but the conditioning of their military training remained strong. Unusual events were to be treated with suspicion. What they found was a dining hall transformed. Tables had been arranged with place settings, the room was warm, and the incredible smell of roasting turkey, baking bread, cinnamon, and nutmeg, filled the air. Sergeant Yamamoto, the same man who had been captured on Guadalcanal nearly a year earlier, was among the prisoners present that day. In his post-war memoir, he described the moment. "We entered the hall in silence, as we did everything. We had learned to move quietly, to not draw attention. But when we saw the tables, the white cloths, the place settings, I did not understand. And then the American soldiers began bringing out the food. Platter after platter. Whole birds, roasted golden. Mountains of white potatoes, green vegetables, bread, both white and brown. Pies. I had never seen American pies before. The abundance was shocking. The traditional Thanksgiving spread had been prepared in full. Roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, and pumpkin pie for dessert. Coffee, a luxury in the camp, was provided. The portions were generous, the same as those given to the American personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington addressed the assembled group, with Lieutenant Chen translating. According to multiple accounts, he spoke briefly about the meaning of Thanksgiving, about gratitude in difficult times, and about the hope that all men, present would someday return to their families and homes. He did not gloss over the fact of war, nor did he pretend that they were not enemies, but he emphasized their shared humanity. He said something I will never forget. Yamamoto wrote. He said, "Today we give thanks not just for what we have, but for the chance to recognize the dignity in all human beings." I did not fully understand these words at the time, but I felt something shift inside me. What happened next was not immediate. The prisoners did not suddenly begin weeping or expressing gratitude. Japanese culture, and particularly military culture, placed enormous emphasis on emotional restraint. To show strong emotion publicly was to show weakness. Instead, the prisoners ate in near silence. But it was a different quality of silence than usual. Guards observed prisoners staring at their plates, seemingly unable to believe what was before them. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite. Others ate mechanically, as if fearing the food would be taken away. It was during the meal that the first man broke down. Private Kenji Sato was 22 years old, captured on Guadalcanal after being wounded by shrapnel. He had barely survived the infection that followed, saved by American medics who had treated him with sulfa drugs and surgical intervention. He had been in captivity for 10 months. As he ate, tears began rolling down his face. He made no sound, no sob, but the tears came freely. Other prisoners noticed, then looked away. To stare would have added to his humiliation, but guards saw, and Lieutenant Chen came over to see if something was wrong. "I asked him if he was ill," Chen later recounted. He shook his head. Then, in broken English, he'd been learning from some of the guards, he said, "I do not understand kindness. That's all. I do not understand kindness." And then he did start to cry. Really cry. He put his head down on the table and his shoulders shook. This moment seemed to open a floodgate. Within minutes, other prisoners began to show emotion. Some wept quietly. Others sat frozen, staring at nothing. A few began speaking rapidly in Japanese, seemingly to themselves. Corporal Yamada Ichiro, who had been captured on New Georgia, later explained what many prisoners were feeling. "We had been taught that we were already dead, that our families mourned us, that we had no place in the world. And here were our enemies, feeding us food from their own celebration, treating us not as the disgraced and dishonored, but as men." The contrast between what we had been taught to expect and what we experienced was too great. Something inside broke. The breakdown was not universal. Some prisoners maintained their composure throughout the meal. But guards estimated that perhaps a third of the men present showed visible emotion, and those who remained composed often did so only with tremendous effort. One guard, Private First Class Michael O'Connor from Boston, later wrote to his family about the experience. "Ma, I don't know how to describe it. These men who we've been told are fanatics who would never surrender, who would fight to the death. We gave them a Thanksgiving meal, and some of them cried like babies. I know that sounds like I'm being mean, but I don't mean it that way. It was like they couldn't believe anyone would be kind to them. It made me think about everything differently. They're just soldiers, like us. They were told to fight, like we were. And now they're prisoners, and they're scared and confused, and we gave them turkey and pie, and some of them broke down crying. War is a hell of a thing, Ma." The immediate aftermath of the Thanksgiving meal was a period of intense processing for both the prisoners and their captors. For the Japanese POWs, the experience had cracked open something that many had been holding tightly closed. The acknowledgement that they were still human beings worthy of basic dignity. In the days that followed, interpreters reported an unprecedented level of openness from prisoners. Men who had previously refused to speak about anything beyond their name and rank began to talk. Some asked questions about America, about the war, about whether they might someday return to Japan. Others wanted to understand why they had been treated kindly. What did the Americans expect to gain? Lieutenant Chen and his fellow interpreters worked overtime to facilitate these conversations. Chen noted in his reports that the psychological shift was profound. Prior to Thanksgiving, most prisoners existed in a state of passive resignation. They ate, they slept, they followed orders, but there was no engagement with their circumstances. After Thanksgiving, we saw curiosity, questions, even occasional laughter. It was as if they had been granted permission to be human again. This transformation had practical implications. Intelligence officers found prisoners much more willing to provide information, not through coercion or trickery, but through simple conversation. The information provided wasn't always militarily significant, but the cumulative effect was substantial. Understanding Japanese military culture, psychology, and tactics from the perspective of soldiers who had lived it proved invaluable. But more than intelligence, what emerged was a series of relationships, limited by circumstance and language, but real nonetheless. Guards and prisoners who had previously maintained strict distance began to interact more naturally. A guard might teach a prisoner a few English words. A prisoner might show a guard how to fold paper into origami shapes. These small exchanges of humanity began to change the atmosphere of the camp. Not everyone approved. Some American personnel felt that such fraternization was inappropriate, that it softened necessary military discipline or dishonored American servicemen suffering in Japanese POW camps. These concerns were not entirely without merit. Even as Japanese prisoners in American camps experienced decent treatment, American and Allied prisoners in Japanese hands endured horrific conditions. The death rate among Allied POWs in Japanese camps would eventually reach nearly 27%, compared to about 4% for Allied prisoners in German camps. The Burma Railway, Bataan, Unit 731, these and other atrocities represented a systematic disregard for the most basic principles of humane treatment. Some American servicemen felt that extending kindness to Japanese prisoners while American POWs suffered was a betrayal. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington addressed these concerns in a staff meeting in early December. "I understand the anger. I understand the desire for reciprocity. But we do not determine our conduct based on the worst actions of our enemies. We act according to our own values, our own codes, and our own moral compass. If we abandon those because our enemies have, then they have won something far more valuable than any battle. They have made us like them. I will not permit that in this camp." Word of the Thanksgiving dinner spread through the POW camp network. Prisoners who were transferred between facilities brought stories with them. At some camps, commanders heard about Harrington's decision and made similar choices for Christmas or New Year's. At others, enhanced meals were provided without the ceremonial context. But the psychological impact of the Thanksgiving meal at Camp McCoy became something of a turning point in how the American military approached the treatment of Japanese prisoners. Reports from the camp documented the improved cooperation, the better mental health of prisoners, and the increased intelligence value of humane treatment. These reports influenced policy at higher levels. By early 1944, guidelines for POW camps were updated to emphasize not just adequate treatment, but dignified treatment. The distinction was subtle but important. Adequate treatment met the minimum requirements of international law. Dignified treatment recognized prisoners as human beings deserving of basic respect. This shift had practical effects on the ground. Camps were encouraged to allow prisoners to maintain certain cultural practices that didn't conflict with security. Japanese prisoners were permitted to observe certain festivals, to maintain small gardens, and to engage in traditional crafts. Educational programs were expanded, allowing prisoners to learn English and, eventually, about democratic governance and American culture. These programs would prove significant in the post-war years. Many Japanese POWs who spent extensive time in American custody returned to Japan with a fundamentally different understanding of American society and values than the propaganda they had been fed during the war. Some would become advocates for democracy and reconciliation in post-war Japan. Sergeant Yamamoto, whose journey from wounded prisoner to eventual repatriation spanned nearly 3 years, described this evolution in his memoir. That Thanksgiving dinner was the beginning of my education. Not an education in American superiority. The Americans never claimed superiority over us, but an education in the possibility of dignity in defeat, of humanity across enemy lines, of values that transcended nationality. When I returned to Japan in 1946, I was a different man than the one who had fought on Guadalcanal. The war had defeated us militarily, but my time as a prisoner had taught me that defeat need not mean the loss of all that made us human. Behind the historical narrative are individual human stories, men whose lives were forever changed by the simple act of sharing a meal. Kenji Sato, the young soldier who first wept openly at the Thanksgiving dinner, survived the war and returned to Japan in 1946. He struggled with the stigma of having been a prisoner, but eventually found work as a teacher in Osaka. In 1952, he began corresponding with Lieutenant Chen, who had transitioned from military service to teaching at a university in California. Their letters, preserved in Chen's papers, reveal a deep friendship that transcended their wartime roles. Sato never married, but he mentored hundreds of students over his 4 decades of teaching. He was particularly kind to students who felt like outsiders or failures, and several of his former students later attributed their success to his encouragement. Sato died in 1989, and his funeral was attended by more than 300 people. Hiroshi Nakamura, the PFC captured on New Georgia, had a more difficult journey. He returned to Japan to find that his family had indeed held a funeral for him, believing him dead. His parents had aged dramatically. His younger brother had died in the Philippines, and his fiancée had married another man. The shame of his survival as a prisoner was compounded by his family's visible disappointment that he had not died honorably. Nakamura struggled with depression and alcoholism for years, but in 1955 he joined a Buddhist monastery, finding in religious practice a path toward peace. He eventually became a monk and spent 30 years serving at a temple in Kyoto, where he was known for his compassion toward those struggling with shame and failure. In his later years, he wrote essays about the nature of honor and humanity that drew on his experiences as a POW. He died in 1997, at peace with his past. Michael O'Connor, the Boston guard who wrote to his mother about the Thanksgiving dinner, returned to Massachusetts after the war and became a police officer. He was known as a fair and humane officer, particularly in his interactions with Japanese immigrants in Boston's small but growing Japanese-American community. In the 1960s, he testified before Congress about the need for humane treatment of prisoners during the Vietnam War, drawing on his experiences at Camp McCoy. He maintained that the kindness shown to Japanese POWs had not only been morally right, but had practical benefits in terms of cooperation and intelligence gathering. O'Connor died in 2003, remembered by his community as a man of principle. Lieutenant Robert Chen, the Nisei interpreter, had a particularly complex experience. As a Japanese American, he served his country while Japanese Americans were being held in internment camps. His own parents spent the war years at Manzanar in California. After the war, Chen dedicated himself to education and reconciliation. He earned a doctorate in psychology and pioneered research into cross-cultural understanding and the psychological effects of war. His work with Japanese POWs informed his academic career and his advocacy for Japanese-American redress. He received numerous honors for his contributions to U.S.-Japan relations and died in 2008, leaving behind a legacy of scholarship and advocacy. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, the camp commander, retired from the military in 1946 with the rank of colonel. He returned to his home in Virginia and lived quietly, rarely speaking about his wartime service. When asked about the Thanksgiving dinner decision, he typically deflected credit, saying he had simply done what was proper under military regulations. In private correspondence, however, he revealed a deeper motivation. Having served in World War I, he had witnessed the dehumanizing effects of war on all participants. He believed that maintaining humanity in the midst of war's brutality was not weakness, but strength. Harrington died in 1978, and his family donated his papers to a military history archive, where they provide valuable insight into the ethical considerations of POW treatment. The story of Japanese POWs being moved by a Thanksgiving dinner exists within a much larger and more complex context that deserves examination. While the humanity shown at Camp McCoy and similar facilities represents an admirable aspect of American conduct during the war, it would be incomplete and misleading to present this story without acknowledging the broader picture. The treatment of Japanese POWs in American custody was generally in line with Geneva Convention standards, particularly after the initial chaos of combat. However, this was not universal. In combat zones, particularly in the early years of the war, the taking of prisoners was complicated by several factors. The Japanese military's own policy of fighting to the death, instances of Japanese soldiers feigning surrender to launch attacks, the brutal nature of jungle warfare, and the racial prejudices that infected both sides of the conflict. There were documented cases of American forces killing Japanese soldiers who were attempting to surrender, particularly in the heat of battle. The racial dimension of the Pacific War, the dehumanizing propaganda that portrayed Japanese as subhuman, treacherous, and fanatical, affected how some American servicemen viewed and treated the enemy. While official policy mandated proper treatment of prisoners, implementation in combat conditions was uneven. Moreover, the contrast between the treatment of Japanese POWs and the treatment of Japanese Americans during the same period is stark and troubling. While the U.S. military worked to maintain humane standards for enemy prisoners, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in internment camps under Executive Order 9266. These camps, while not comparable to the brutal conditions of Axis POW camps, represented a fundamental violation of civil rights and constitutional principles. The irony was not lost on Japanese Americans serving in the military. Soldiers like Lieutenant Chen served their country while their families were imprisoned. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Nisei soldiers, became one of the most decorated units in American military history, even as their families remained behind barbed wire. This context complicates any simple narrative about American humanity versus Japanese brutality. While it is true that American treatment of POWs was generally far superior to Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners, the United States was not without its own moral failings during the war. Additionally, we must acknowledge that the humane treatment of Japanese POWs described in this documentary was not primarily motivated by pure altruism. Military intelligence, psychological operations, and post-war planning all played roles in the decision to treat prisoners well. The hope that humane treatment might encourage surrender, thus saving American lives, was a constant consideration. The value of intelligence gleaned from cooperative prisoners was significant, and by 1943, American leaders were already thinking about the post-war world and the need for a stable, non-hostile Japan. This does not diminish the genuine humanity shown by individuals like Lieutenant Colonel Harrington or the guards who work to treat prisoners with dignity. Individual acts of kindness can be both morally good and strategically useful, but it's important to understand these actions within their full context. To truly understand the emotional impact of the Thanksgiving dinner, we must also understand what Japanese soldiers expected based on their own military culture and the treatment of prisoners by Japanese forces. The Japanese military's treatment of POWs during World War II was systematically brutal. This was not accidental or the result of resource scarcity alone, though scarcity played a role, but stemmed from deeply held beliefs about the dishonor of surrender and the corresponding lack of rights for those who surrendered. Allied POWs in Japanese camps faced starvation rations, forced labor, inadequate medical care, and routine beatings. The mortality rate was appalling. Beyond physical mistreatment, prisoners faced systematic humiliation designed to break their spirit. The Japanese military viewed Allied prisoners with contempt. They had surrendered rather than fight to the death, which in the Japanese military value system represented ultimate failure. This cultural context is crucial for understanding the Japanese POW experience in American hands. Many Japanese prisoners genuinely believed they would receive the same brutal treatment they knew their own side meted out. The cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality was profound. Some prisoners initially interpreted kind treatment as a sophisticated form of torture, a psychological trick designed to make them drop their guard before the real brutality began. Others thought Americans were simply following a different tactical approach, but with the same ultimate contempt. The idea that Americans might treat prisoners well because their value system genuinely required it was, for many, difficult to comprehend. Warrant Officer Koji Tanaka, captured in the Philippines in 1944, described this confusion in a post-war interview. For weeks, I waited for the moment when the mask would drop. The Americans gave us food, medicine, shelter, but I believed this was temporary. I thought they were extracting intelligence through kindness, and once they had what they wanted, we would be executed. It took months before I began to believe that this treatment was genuine, that it was how they believed prisoners should be treated. Even then, I struggled to reconcile this with everything I had been taught about American cruelty and barbarism. The breakdown of some prisoners at the Thanksgiving dinner was not simply about being fed a good meal. It was about the collision of their entire worldview with a fundamentally different reality. They had been conditioned to believe that surrender meant death or brutality. Instead, they found themselves being treated with a level of dignity that confused, moved, and ultimately began to transform them. The story of the Thanksgiving dinner and the broader treatment of Japanese POWs in American custody had implications that extended well beyond the war itself. When Japanese prisoners began returning home in 1945 and 1946, they brought with them stories that contrasted sharply with wartime propaganda. This was not a simple process. Many returning POWs faced severe stigma in post-war Japan. The shame of having been captured remained powerful, and some former prisoners struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. Families sometimes rejected them. Employment was difficult to find. Some prisoners found that their experiences in American captivity, particularly any positive experiences, were treated with suspicion or hostility. But over time, as Japan began to rebuild and reorient itself, the experiences of former POWs contributed to a broader understanding of American society and values. This was particularly true for the generation that came of age in the 1950s and 1960s, as Japan transformed from a defeated, occupied nation into an economic powerhouse and democratic ally. Some historians argue that the treatment of Japanese POWs, along with other aspects of the American occupation, such as the relative restraint shown during the occupation period, the decision not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito, and the massive economic assistance provided through programs like the Dodge Plan, helped facilitate Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. While MacArthur's occupation policies and Japanese agency were certainly the primary drivers, the cumulative effect of many individual experiences, including those of former POWs, contributed to a foundation for reconciliation. Educational exchanges between the United States and Japan in the post-war period sometimes included former POWs on both sides. Programs brought together American veterans and Japanese veterans, including some who had been prisoners. These encounters were often difficult, but also healing. Men who had been enemies found common ground in their shared experiences of war, loss, and survival. The story of Japanese POWs and the Thanksgiving dinner also became part of a broader conversation about the laws of war, the treatment of prisoners, and the role of humanity in armed conflict. As international humanitarian law developed and evolved in the post-war period, experiences from World War II, both positive and negative, informed the conversations. The Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded in 1949, with specific attention to the treatment of POWs. While the primary driver of these revisions was the horrific treatment of prisoners by Axis powers, the positive examples of prisoner treatment, including American treatment of Japanese POWs, provided models for what humane treatment could look like in practice. How should we remember and understand the story of Japanese POWs breaking down when served Thanksgiving dinner? This question has no simple answer, and different perspectives offer different insights. From one perspective, this story represents the triumph of American values, the maintenance of humanity and dignity even toward enemies in the midst of a brutal war. It demonstrates that it is possible to wage war effectively while still adhering to moral principles and international law. It shows the power of simple human kindness to transcend even the deepest divisions of conflict. From another perspective, this story highlights the destructive nature of militaristic indoctrination. The fact that soldiers were so thoroughly conditioned to expect brutality that basic human decency moved them to tears reveals the depths of dehumanization inherent in the Japanese military system, and by extension, in all systems that reduce individuals to instruments of state violence. From yet another perspective, this story is about the universal human need for dignity. Regardless of nationality, culture, or circumstance, human beings require recognition of their fundamental humanity. When that recognition is denied, as it was by the Japanese military's treatment of surrender, the psychological damage is profound. When it is affirmed, as it was by Americans who chose to treat prisoners with dignity, healing becomes possible. The story also raises uncomfortable questions. Why does it take a relatively small act of kindness to provoke such a strong reaction? What does that say about the baseline of human cruelty in war? If American treatment of Japanese POWs was remarkable for its humanity, what does that suggest about the typical conduct of war? And how do we reconcile the humanity shown in POW camps with the indiscriminate firebombing of Japanese cities or the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps they shouldn't. The reality of war is that it contains multitudes, acts of supreme courage and profound cruelty, moments of transcendent humanity and depths of barbarity, all coexisting in the same time and space. The Thanksgiving dinner represents one truth about the war. The horrors of Bataan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa represent others. All are part of the same historical reality. In researching this documentary, numerous interviews and memoirs from individuals involved in these events reveal the lasting impact of these experiences. Former prisoner Yamada Ichiro, who we met earlier weeping at his meal, wrote in 1975, "I am an old man now, and my memories of the war have faded in some ways. The faces of comrades who died are less clear than they once were. The sounds and smells of battle have receded, but I will never forget that Thanksgiving Day in 1943. I can still taste the food, still feel the warmth of the room, still remember the confusion I felt at being treated with such unexpected kindness. That day changed me. It did not make me love my enemies. That would be too simple. But it made me understand that the world was more complex than I had been taught, that honor and humanity could take forms I had never imagined, that even in the midst of war's brutality, there were men who chose to see the humanity in their enemies." Lieutenant Chen, in an interview conducted in 1998, reflected on his role. "I was in a unique position, being Japanese American and serving as an interpreter. I could understand both sides. The American guards who struggled with anger at what had been done to our prisoners in Japanese camps, and the Japanese prisoners who expected only the worst and were confused by any kindness. The Thanksgiving dinner was powerful precisely because it required nothing from the prisoners. No cooperation, no intelligence, no change in behavior. It was simply a gift, an extension of humanity. In my career studying cross-cultural understanding, I've come to believe that such moments, unexpected, unconditional acts of recognition, have power beyond anything we can measure. They create the possibility for transformation that lectures, propaganda, or even shared interests cannot. Colonel Harrington, in a private letter to his wife, written shortly after the Thanksgiving dinner, revealed his own thoughts. "I don't know if what we did today will make any difference in the larger scope of this terrible war. Perhaps those men will return to Japan and forget everything about this day. Perhaps our gesture was naive, a sentimental indulgence in the midst of hard military realities. But I cannot shake the feeling that something important happened today. When those men broke down, when they allowed themselves to feel the full weight of their confusion, their relief, their unexpected gratitude, I saw something crack open. Not their military discipline, but something deeper. The wall they had built around their humanity to survive what they had been taught and what they had endured. I chose to feed them not because I thought it would win the war, but because I believed it was right. If that makes me soft, so be it. I have seen enough of war's hardness to last a lifetime." As we reach the end of this documentary, it's worth considering what lessons, if any, can be drawn from this story. The temptation is to extract simple morals. Kindness conquers hate. Humanity transcends conflict. Treating enemies with dignity serves strategic interests. But the truth is more nuanced. The Thanksgiving dinner did not end the war. It did not prevent the continued brutal fighting across the Pacific, the kamikazes, the firebombing of Tokyo, or the atomic bombs. The prisoners who wept at that meal did not suddenly transform into American allies or renounce their own country. The guards who served them continued to be soldiers in a war against Japan. What the dinner did do was create a moment, brief but profound, where the human cost of war's dehumanization became visible. It revealed that beneath the layers of propaganda, military indoctrination, and wartime hatred, the capacity for connection remained. It demonstrated that institutions and individuals could choose humanity even when not required to do so. The story also raises difficult questions about the nature of reconciliation. Can acts of individual kindness overcome systematic brutality? Does humane treatment of some prisoners balance the scales against atrocities committed elsewhere? How do we hold in our minds both the reality of American humanity toward Japanese POWs and American injustice toward Japanese Americans? How do we honor the dignity shown by men like Colonel Harrington while acknowledging the limits of what such dignity could achieve? These questions matter because war continues. POWs continue to be taken, and their treatment continues to vary wildly depending on who holds them and under what circumstances. The tensions between military necessity and humanitarian principles remain unresolved. The challenge of maintaining one's own values while fighting an enemy who may not share them is as relevant today as it was in 1943. On November 25, 1993, 50 years after the Thanksgiving dinner at Camp McCoy, a small ceremony was held at the site of the former POW camp. By then, the camp itself had long since been decommissioned and the land repurposed. But a historical marker had been placed to commemorate the facility's role in housing POWs during the war. 3 former Japanese prisoners attended the ceremony. They were elderly men now, in their 70s and 80s, who had made the long journey from Japan specifically for this event. Several American veterans who had served as guards also attended, equally elderly, some in wheelchairs. The ceremony was simple. A local historian spoke briefly about the camp's history. A minister offered a prayer for reconciliation and peace. And then the former prisoners and guards shared a meal together. Not an elaborate Thanksgiving feast, but simple sandwiches, coffee, and apple pie. Kenji Sato, the young soldier who had first wept openly at the original dinner, was among those present. Now 72 years old and long since retired from teaching, he stood to speak. Through a translator, he said, 50 years ago, I sat in a room not far from here and ate a meal that changed my life. I was expecting death, and instead I received kindness. I was expecting condemnation, and instead I received dignity. That day taught me that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are those who choose light. I returned to Japan carrying that lesson, and I have tried to live by it ever since. I taught my students that honor is not found in never falling, but in how we treat those who have fallen. That lesson came from this place, from that meal, from men who chose to see me as a human being rather than just an enemy. I am grateful to have lived long enough to return and say thank you. When he finished, several of the American veterans approached him. They shook hands, then embraced. An elderly man in a wheelchair, Michael O'Connor, the guard who had written to his mother about the original dinner, gripped Sato's hand and said simply, "I'm glad you made it home." The ceremony lasted only an hour, but those who attended remembered it for the rest of their lives. It was not about glorifying war or minimizing its horrors. It was about recognizing a moment when humanity prevailed, however briefly, and honoring the men on both sides who made that moment possible. The story of Japanese POWs breaking down when served Thanksgiving dinner is ultimately a story about the resilience of human dignity in the face of systems designed to destroy it. War seeks to reduce people to categories: enemy, ally, combatant, threat. Military training, propaganda, and the brutal necessities of survival in combat all work to strip away individual humanity and replace it with simpler, more manageable identities. But underneath all of that, the human person persists. The soldiers who wept at that Thanksgiving table were not crying just because they were fed. They were crying because someone had seen them, really seen them, not as categories, but as human beings. They were crying because they had been shown that even in their defeat, their disgrace by their own culture's standards, their total vulnerability, they still possessed inherent worth. And the Americans who made the decision to serve that meal, who cooked it, who set the tables and filled the plates, they too were engaged in an act of seeing. They chose to look past the uniform, the enemy designation, the legitimate grievances and anger, and recognize fellow human beings. This is not a story with easy heroes and villains. The Japanese prisoners had served in an army that committed terrible atrocities. The American Guards served in a nation that was simultaneously incarcerating its own citizens based on their ancestry. The war itself was a catastrophe that would claim millions of lives and leave scars that persist generations later. But within that larger tragedy, there were moments when individuals chose differently. They chose to maintain standards of treatment, not because it was easy or because they expected reward, but because they believed it was right. They chose to extend dignity even to those who might not have extended it to them. They chose to see possibilities for humanity, even in the midst of war's dehumanization. The emotional breakdown of those prisoners, men conditioned to show no weakness, to expect no mercy, to embrace death rather than dishonor, testifies to the power of such choices. A simple meal, shared without expectation of return, cracked open something that military discipline and cultural conditioning had sealed tight. That is worth remembering, not because it redeems war, or because it makes the Pacific conflict something other than the brutal catastrophe it was, but because it reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the choice for humanity remains possible. It may not change the outcome of battles or the trajectory of history, but it changes the individuals involved, and through them, ripples out in ways we may never fully measure. 75 years later, in a world still marked by conflict, division, and the persistent human capacity for cruelty, that remains a lesson worth carrying forward. The table, the meal, the tears, these simple things testify to a truth larger than strategy or politics, that recognizing the humanity in others, especially our enemies, is not weakness, but strength. It is the foundation upon which any lasting peace must be built. The Japanese prisoners who broke down at Thanksgiving dinner in 1943 have mostly passed now. The Americans who served them are nearly all gone as well. But their story endures, a quiet testament to the possibility of dignity in the midst of war, of humanity in the face of hate, and of hope even in the darkest hours.